Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Henry Mbede. I'll be the moderator for this particular session on the launch of the Handbook on Issuing Municipal Sustainable Bonds in South Africa. I'm pleased that we are all here, and when we come to specific speakers, we'll introduce them one by one so they'll be able to be focused on. Now, the program is 90 minutes. We have segmented it into short versions in terms of 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes. And then we will actually have a session where we'll have Q&A. What you're going to do is more or less to set the stage for us to have a discussion on why we are here, where we have come from, and where we want to go. So first of all, before we continue, I would really like to appreciate you as participants for coming on. And I would also like to say that you're coming from different regions, and that's why it's very, very important that, we all know who we are. But I would like to thank the partners with whom we have worked on this particular program. The European Union, led by Bernard Krab and Aline, they really supported us financially in terms of advisory during the preparation and development of this particular project. The Swedish Development Agency, represented by Elizabeth, Austrian Development Agency, represented by Sandra, and our board, where we had UNEP and UNDP working together, but Team Sport in New York, and Jupna, our co-manager, Kapona Manjolo, Milan, Yana, Assad Makan, and of course the support of Nado Zekele Thomas from South Africa. From the UNEP side, I really like to recognize David Osborne, Mireya Talak, Justin Stenhal, who is the core manager, Juliet Biao, Deshan Sharing from Asia Pacific, Frank Uriatunga, Africa Office, David Smith, Jonathan Gilman from Bangkok, Yang Ran from Bangkok, Jacinto Cuaro, and Michael Stanley Jones in Nairobi, and Dina Korea. And the former co-manager, who has since joined the UNRISP, Isabel Kamp, is now based in Bonn. She's in charge of the Institute for Social Development. She's really been very supportive because of the institutional memory she had on this. For GIZ, Gabriel Watner and Nondumiso Damukude in South Africa, though they have moved, but they're very, very instrumental in helping us to put this thing together. The Partnership for Action on Green Economy, Claudia Athman and Rowan Palmer, who from Geneva, thank you very much for your support. But none of this would have been very possible without the support of the Republic of South Africa. Janita and Leanne Richard, thank you very much from Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, South Africa. And also input from Indonesia, led by Mohamed Didi Hardiana. So this was very, very useful collaboration between all of us to make sure that we pull this one through. Now, for housekeeping, we are going to, you realize that the microphones are automatically disabled, but it will be activated when you're given the floor. And at that point, you will also have your image projected on the screen. On that particular screen, you'll see there is a tool on Q&A. There is also a tool on chat for interactive chat. So you can have comments on there, and the speakers and panelists are at liberty to dialogue with you on the chat. And when we come to the Q&A, we'll select what we have that can respond to a lot of the questions. So at this stage, I'll request most of the people who are on the screen to turn off their camera so that only the speaker can now be projected on the screen. And I would like to say that the preparation of this handbook started in 2020. It was influenced in several ways. We borrowed from the Indonesian Sukuk, where there's a transformation from regional green bonds into sovereign sustainability bonds. That was a really good lesson learned. And even the amounts went into billions of dollars for the bonds once they were issued. It became a national issue there. We also borrowed from the principle of engaging the public and private sector in tandem with SDG 17. We even had an event, a webinar, where we brought in the public and private sector to discuss experience of the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, that is PAGE, and also the GISS Green Economy Transition really gave us a lot of confidence that South Africa is very ready for the green bonds. And also the green bonds experience in South Africa, where 2010, the city of Johannesburg floated green bond, and also the Johannesburg Stock Exchange in 2014 launched the green bonds in the stock exchange, and also the city of Cape Town in 2018 gave us additional confidence that what we are doing is really not lost. We're very lucky that we had an international practitioner who is Carbon Trust, operating locally in South Africa, and we tapped a lot from Carbon Trust. And thank you, Crystal, for your support. It was very, very useful because this was the era of the COVID-19, so it was very difficult to move. But now that you're domiciled in South Africa, the Africa office, I think we're very happy that you could benefit and tap the resources from you. And the willingness of South African government to partner, especially the Department of Environment, Forest and Fisheries of the National Treasury, was a great added value. You mobilized the people from the finance and the technical side to be part of the training program that we had, and especially for the Ikwini and also the Shwane municipalities that became the focal point for this. But above all, we are quite lucky that South Africa enshrines in its Bill of Rights that all citizens are entitled to clean and healthy environment. And I think this was a driving force for us. The South African municipalities also have a constitutional responsibility to mobilize economic resources towards improvement of lives of all citizens. Therefore, this will be a very easy sale to the South African public, and especially the targeted municipalities, to get the service provision by them contributing to the resource mobilization process. Globally, we are lucky that the paradigm shift based on the Agenda 2030 to the UN Sustainable Development Goals gives us a good framework with which to work and achieve what we can, and especially on the different issues that are affecting us on climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and chemicals and waste that we're grappling with at the moment. UNEP, we are calling it, the triple planetary crisis. So against this background, the publication of South African Green Finance Taxonomy by National Treasury April 2022, and also the technical paper on financing a sustainable economy gave us a very strong technical basis on how we could formulate what we have. So as you can see, the development of Handbook on Sustainable Bonds as a tool was predicated on several premises as stated above. It was actually catalyzed through the work of UNEP, UNDP, Poverty Environment Action for SDG project, which is a project supported by partners such as the European Union and other bilateral donors, as has been acknowledged. And on that note, I would like all of you to please join me by clapping and applauding and congratulating and thank all partners that have been part of this journey. Thank you very much. I know you clapped, some of us are muted. So at this point, I would like to introduce and invite Navina Sanchez of GISS South Africa, who will make welcoming remarks. Navina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. And it's a bit difficult to not be tempted to echo everything you have said and leave it there. But with that, maybe good morning, Janita. Good morning, Wendy, Gregor, UNPA colleagues, ladies and gentlemen online. First and foremost, thank you so much for inviting me to the virtual launch again and allowing the German Technical Development Corporation to provide welcome remarks at this very important event. For GIZ, we work currently with different work streams under sustainable finance and supporting the government of South Africa. And as Henry has mentioned before, we really would like to take a step and thank the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, National Treasury, several actors of the private sector, but also our implementing partners, UNDP, UN Environment Program with the PIA, UN with the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, and other actors that have made this possible. The cooperation with the previously mentioned players allowed us to really dive into the momentum of green bonds in South Africa, and for green bonds to be deepened at the local level. The handbook you will be learning more about today, just to give you a sneak preview, provides municipalities with a comprehensive guide outlining the process in a step-by-step approach and providing detailed practical recommendations for the end-to-end process of preparing, issuing, and managing sustainable bonds. Swane Metropolitan Municipality and Equitini Metropolitan Municipality have become pioneers in testing the handbook over the past months, as well as there are other countries that have expressed interest in testing this into their country. So we're really excited to see the momentum that the handbook is also getting for other areas. And none of this would have been possible without having the FFE and National Treasury really at the driving seat of this process, and having that momentum. As the phase of the green economy transformation project in South Africa, I would really like to highlight this is a project that is implemented in cooperation with JSET and our brothers and sisters from the UN Environment Program. And on behalf of the Green Economy Transformation Project, I would like to use this opportunity to really thank the FFE, National Treasury, Carbon Trust, PIA for the excellent cooperation, as well as other colleagues who have been supporting this process. I'm not naming anybody by name because this would take some time, but I think all the names that have been said before by Henry do cover the scope of the several actors that were involved on this process. With all protocol observed, I would just like to echo how helpful it was to have their critical eye and helpful comments in this process. So with that, I would really like to welcome you to the event today, and I hope you enjoy learning more about the handbook. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Navina, for opening this for us with those encouraging foundational words, which we'll use now to build on this particular process today. It's my pleasure now to introduce and invite Janita Badu, Senior Policy Advisor for Sustainability Programs and Projects at the Department of Environment, Forest and Fisheries of South Africa. Janita will give us remarks on the climate finance and the linkage to sustainable bonds. Janita, over to you.
Thank you so much, Henry, for that welcoming remarks, and thank you to our partners who we mentioned earlier on, the GIZ.
Alex,
on the GIZ with regard to the process, and we at a point supportive of this process, and we certainly appreciated the technical insight provided to the handbook. Not forgetting the work of the PA, Jacinta, Henry, in leading us on this process and initiating the process through the ICI project. We sincerely appreciate it. Let me also acknowledge UNDP and UNEP. We've had colleagues, I don't see the colleague from UNEP online, but nonetheless, we've received extensive support in that regard. And I know that the opening remarks are talking to acknowledgement of the partners and the work that there has been undertaken in getting to where we're at, but it's equally important to bring to the fore who's been behind the scenes in getting to where we are currently. So if I have obviously left colleagues out in these acknowledgements, then I would obviously be remiss of it. I would want to at this point also greet the colleagues who have joined in virtually to celebrate this moment of the launch of the handbook. And with that, I would acknowledge Gregor Patterson-Jones and Christelle van Vieren, who've actually been at the helm of pushing through the technical work which we needed to undertake in order to get the handbook in place. That being said, I would want to remind our virtual audience of the 1972 report of Limits of Growth, which was put out by the Club of Rome. And at that point, what was indicated was that civilization would collapse sometime during the 21st century should we continue in this unprecedented manner of increasing population as well as industrial growth, invariably, exhausting the world's resources as a result of the demand. And today we're sitting with a situation of business as usual for the majority across the world, whilst attempts and initiatives are being put in place to transition to a low carbon economy. It's equally important that if we continue with the business as usual approach, we are going to perpetuate this archaic approach instead of embracing sustainable consumption and production patterns. And the time is definitely upon us, for the need for redress, the need for social inclusion, as well as the need for environmental imperatives. And equally important, the question which is being posed is, are we locking in carbon for the current and future generations, as we do have a choice on which way to go. So other key pertinent questions which we need to take into consideration as we celebrate this moment of the launch of the Green Bonds Handbook for municipalities is, how do we actually catalyze climate action at the local government level? And what are the push and pull factors in channeling the much needed support which is required
Janita,
at the local government level, through.
We're struggling to hear. Maybe if you can switch off your camera, then we'll get your voice. I think there's a bandwidth issue, Janita, if you don't mind. Yeah. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Not a problem, Program Director. So is it clearly audible at this point?
Yes, it is much better.
Okay. Thank you. So one such mechanism of actually unlocking financing of initiatives at the local government level is through the issuance of sustainability bonds, which are also known as green bonds or known as climate bonds, depending on which name it is registered as or issued as. The proceeds post-issuance of these bonds allows for financing or refinancing of green projects and projects which are pursuing social imperatives. In addition to unlocking alternative sources of finance to support the low carbon development, it's equally imperative to note that sustainable climate action is addressed across all sectors, this being at the local government or municipal level. And we may be able to achieve this imperative through mainstreaming the climate action across the sectors, both by addressing policy as well as institutional capacity needs. Now, several pertinent issues which come to the fore in creating this enabling environment is to ensure that we have relevant frameworks and strategies in place in order to tackle climate action. Secondly, detailed planning coupled with implementation. And furthermore, this has to be followed by at-scale interventions in order to realize the benefits and realize the impact of the transition to a low carbon space as well as a low carbon economy. And then one particular area which seems to fall back in many cases is ensuring that we're addressing the necessary skill sets at the local government level, and through this bringing in the capacity development that is required and necessary at this sphere of government. And finally, unlocking the finances for the meaningful climate action to be undertaken. And as mentioned earlier on in my opening remarks, in celebrating and acknowledging some of the efforts which have been put in place through the Poverty and Environment Action Program supported through UNDP and UNEP, as well as the International Climate Initiative, which is implemented by the German Technical Agency on behalf of the Federal Ministry for Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety, and Consumer Protection. We're at a point where we proud to launch the technical handbook on the issuance of sustainable municipal bonds in South Africa. This work definitely has further been supported through the capacity and awareness raising that was undertaken through the program. And in addition to it, the support that has been rendered to the two participating municipalities, namely the city of Tshwane as well as eThekwini municipality, which are both municipalities in South Africa. Now, the interventions which have been addressed through this particular initiative addressed both the capacity as well as the potential for financing of initiatives at the local government level. And we are hoping that this handbook will allow municipalities to explore alternative financing options to advance sustainable and inclusive development imperatives within the country itself. I must also allude to the recent experiences which has impacted Europe, cities in Europe as well as the USA. And this has certainly spurred on discussions around climate action now, enough of policy talk and how can it be done at scale. And, equally so, municipalities are a critical part of the puzzle because they're based at the grassroots level. They are in a position well placed to both influence and build resilient communities as well as to build resilient cities. And so as we reflect on the achievement of today, and that is the launch of this technical handbook, which will assist municipalities in unlocking finances which are required for low carbon initiatives within these spaces, we must also take responsibility as a collective, take decisive action and act with speed as well as at scale. So with these few remarks, I would like to conclude and thank you for your attention. Over to you, Program Director.
Thank you, Janita Badul, Senior Policy Advisor for Sustainability Programs and Projects at the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries in South Africa. Janita, this is really, really good, and thank you for bringing in the celebrative mood that you're celebrating this launch. I think it is very important that you brought that one up. And if you don't mind, Janita, share with us that the 1972 report on this collapse of civilization in the 21st century. I believe people on this particular platform might want to make a quick reference because maybe what was said over 50 years ago is turning out into reality now. It's very predictive. Thank you for giving us anchorage on capacity, on potential, on the exploration, and also the issue of the climate action for policy and about the responsibilities. That has been very, very useful, and we'll use that one as a springboard for our discussion. So colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, at this point, I'd like to introduce and invite Wendy Tanor, Chief Director, Intergovernmental Policy and Planning, the National Treasury. Wendy will make remarks on sustainable bonds uptake, creating an enabling policy environment. Wendy, over to you.
Thank you very much. If I can just ask that the slide presentation be slotted on my behalf, I really appreciate. But it's really quite a good morning, and I would just like to confirm the previous speakers as well to say this is really a fantastic initiative, and we're really, really glad to be part of launching virtually the technical handbook on helping municipalities to issue sustainable bonds. And it's actually quite opportune because National Treasury is also doing some work on municipal borrowing, and these two processes really, really complement each other. So it is actually absolute good timing from our side. Of course, we were great and very glad to be able to add to this handbook by giving our inputs. And of course, we didn't do it alone. We worked with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, also the great support of the UNDP, UNEP, and also GIZ that really helped us in this regard. If we can just then go to the first slide, we all know, and previous speakers have also alluded to this, climate change is with us. If we ignore it, we ignore it at our own peril. And it's not just resulting in things like green gas emissions, but we're also seeing many, many more natural disasters. And unfortunately for us, South Africa is very, very prone to these natural disasters. And sometimes it is actually quite ironic because in certain provinces, we will have severe floods that does absolute great damage. And then we've got also long-lasting droughts in other provinces at the same time. Of course, what is quite important is that we start seeing this as a reality in South Africa. And we don't see it, oops, it's happened, and now we go to the national fiscus to ask for money. It is much more important that we start focusing on really seeing it as a reality and therefore doing planning for it and mitigation for it. So when it happens, the impact is not that dire and that severe. What we basically determined as well is work done by the CSP, that's the City Support Program. That's a program attached to National Treasury, they have experts in their areas of work. And what has been determined is that we dismally underinvest in response to climate change. And it varies per municipality, but it can be the expenditure that's needed is much, much more than the capital grants. But having said that, particularly for larger municipalities, they've got a range of revenue sources to fund, and the capital budgets or the grants that they get is but a small part of the capital budgets that they have. And therefore, they already use issues such as borrowing. And it is just how can we then look at using those municipal external borrowing that they undertake much more strategically than what they're currently doing. Of course, for smaller municipalities, it's much more difficult to leverage in private sector finance. But even conditional grants, when money is given from the national fiscus to the municipalities concerned, we can look at how we can actually then leverage in borrowing as well. So the Municipal Borrowing Framework is very, very old. It is part of the Municipal Finance Management Act, which regulate municipal finances, and it was done as part of that work. And it's actually quite well established. The policy was actually quite well written, but after many, many years, because it was originally put in place in 2000, we're basically saying, what are the gaps? Because certain things that we expected to happen didn't really happen. For example, we would have liked the borrowing market to be broader than what it currently is. We still think municipalities are quite shy to undertake external borrowing. What is also not developed is a secondary market. And then also, we didn't clearly stipulate how DFIs can actually participate in the municipal borrowing market. So what we're currently doing is we're reviewing the municipal borrowing framework to enhance those areas. So none of the existing texts have changed, but what we've done is added to the text to make certain things a bit more clear. And this is also, if you can go to the next slide. And this is also then where the municipal borrowing actually then looks at what options are there available. And the first block in the blue then indicates the options that we're putting on the table. Currently, what you generally get is just general borrowing where it's done against no specific projects. It's done against the general budget of the municipality. And we do say that there's much more scope to be much more specific. So there's project finance bonds, there's revenue bonds, there's green bonds. So can you see that then very, very nicely links up to exactly the work that you're doing. So we also from our side was focusing on these issues in addition to other options such as land-based increments where, for example, municipalities can hone in on specific developments and then leverage in finances that way as well. Pooled financing mechanisms where a number of municipalities then club together. It's particularly meant for the smaller municipalities And of course, public-private partnerships is also a very good way to go. So some of the reforms that we're doing is then listed in the next column. As I've already pointed out, we're looking at how can we extend the role of DFIs, for example, to look at new issues where the borrowing market has not yet developed. We don't want them to play against the private sector investors such as banks, but rather to, particularly for the larger municipalities that's already got well-established private sector borrowing and bonds going on, originate new types of borrowing, extending the tenure, for example, looking at how we can actually push green bonds, for example. So those are the issues that we're looking for, and I've already mentioned also the role of DFIs, and they can actually then play a specific role also with regard to these initiatives. If we can then go to the next slide. And we've also looked at what is going currently on. So it shows you the handbook is already very apt and very proper, because if you look at so far, 2 metros, and that's the city of Cape Town and city of Joburg, has already issued green bonds under the current provisions provided for under Section 46 of the Municipal Finance Management Act. And what is very heartening to say is we do not need to make any changes to legislation to enable green bonds. And why do we find the technical handbook so appealing? Is it's practical, it's accessible, it's visually appealing, and it provides detailed information for municipalities on what steps and what issues they need to consider, and when they want to issue a green bond. It also provides to the person that wants to give the green bond also to clarify their roles and responsibilities. So we really think this is a practical handbook that can really help the process and enable municipalities to participate in green bonds. Next slide. Next slide. It looks like, okay, so just the last slide is just to reiterate is that National Treasury finds this work just as important as the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, and that we also think that it's important to mainstream climate responsiveness in city plans, in city budgets, in conditional grant frameworks, and that we provide supporting tools to enable municipalities to do that. I've already highlighted the importance that this handbook can play to support municipalities in this regard. The previous speaker also highlighted the importance of capacity support to municipalities. This is a new area, it is a difficult area, and to really assist municipalities, but also have the necessary interactions with the borrowers to also deal with them to assist that we open up this field in a much more aggressive way. And then what is also quite important that we look at what has been done so far, learn out of those lessons, adapt, add further capacity support and the like, look at what other countries have done, what they've achieved so far, etc., etc. But what is most important, and this is a key point that I would like to stress, is that the key national departments involved in this process, together with support such as DOZ, UNDP, UNEP, collaboration and the like, that continues. So because it's important that government speaks with one voice. It's often that government speak with a forked tongue, and it's, in this instance, we're completely aligned and we're pushing for the same goals. And this is a very important goal because we're looking at how can we protect our country in the future and deal with it in an appropriate way. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wendy. Thank you for this. For sure, the National Treasury and the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries really spoke in one voice. You could see the unanimity of purpose, and that really made our work be very, very easy and practical. And participation, in as much as some of the training programs, in fact, all of them were online, the participation and the resilience and the repeated attendance of the members from both departments was very, very encouraging in terms of the fact that they were speaking with one voice. And that's a very good example for other countries to learn the example of South Africa in this particular aspect. Thank you again, Wendy, for talking about the policy reforms, the financial mechanisms that the National Treasury is looking at, and also for having looked at this handbook and encouraging us, saying that it is visually appealing, it's a practical handbook, it's got clarity of roles defined in there, and I think that's really, really, really good for us, because then it really echoes what the Secretary General of the UN says, that for us to find solutions to a problem, we need solidarity, we need sustainability, and we also need good science to lead us in that. Because as we speak today, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and chemicals and waste is actually been referred to in the Secretary General's report on our common agenda. And when you're talking about the KwaZulu-Natal floods, and of course, some parts of South Africa where you have devastating droughts, this is just a manifestation of the climate change phenomenon that we are having today, where it is very variable and then making also the human life vulnerable. So it is very, very useful that the city support program that you made reference to is one of the low-hanging fruits we want to relate to, especially when we're talking about the municipalities that we're targeting now, because climate change has truly impinged on the human rights. And human rights goes in many ways. And I think when you pull our resources together, speak in one voice, through solidarity, through sustainability and science, we should be able to tackle these issues. So I would really like to, at this point, introduce and invite Gregor Patterson-Jones, who is an independent consultant on green bonds and green financing. Gregor came in just in time to help us push this particular baton through to the finishing line. And Gregor will give us a brief presentation on the content, the significance, and use of sustainable handbook. Gregor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for introducing me. And I'm hoping everyone can see my screen in presentation format. If you can just confirm you can, and then I'll continue.
Very clear, very clear. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. And hello to everybody from sunny Scotland. As you can hear from my accent, I am in fact South African, but I run a consultancy in Scotland, focusing on things like green bonds internationally. And very happy to be assisting in my small part in the launch of this Green Bond Handbook. But I first wanted to put out an enormous thank you to Christelle van Vieren at Carbon Trust and her team, who've done an absolutely brilliant job in holding the pen and creating, writing, designing, and finalizing the Green Bond Handbook, which is a monumental piece of work and very, very well done. The purpose of my presentation today is to just give a taste of what is inside the handbook and explain how it can be used, what the purpose of the handbook is, and more importantly, just some highlights of issues and recommendations when it comes to green bonds for municipalities and how this fits into the financing strategy of an entity like a municipality. So it is, from what we can see in the international market, the first comprehensive guide to the issuance of green bonds for local authorities. And it sets out practical steps for issuance of a bond focused on those aspects which make a green bond different from a normal bond, but very much in the context of a municipality. Now, most importantly, the handbook focuses on what's called use of proceed bonds. And so most of the process, which is explained from pre-issuance to post-issuance, is focused on a issuance of a bond which will have the bond proceeds, the money that's raised, directly related to investment in projects and activities which fulfill the requirements of the taxonomy or the framework which is being used by the municipality. So it explains a comprehensive process right from the preparation work that needs to be done and the conceptualization work that needs to be done before the issuance of a green bond through to the process of issuance, and of course the management and reporting of the sustainable bond. So how does this fit into the municipal cycle, and how is this different from the issuance of a corporate bond? As Wendy explained, a municipality is a particular entity. It's governed by national legislation. It has a set of standardized and regulated processes for running its budget and for allocation of funds and for approval of those funds. And so when you're trying to work on a process of raising money in the context of a green bond, and that money is going to be applied to things which are determined to be fulfilling or the requirements of your green taxonomy or framework, and they are compliant with those, they've also got to fit into the cycle that a municipality works with, both its strategy and its financing. So you start off by looking at, from a municipal cycle point of view, the regulations and the planning that fit into the municipal cycle. So your integrated development plan, your municipal spatial development framework, built environment plan, and so forth, and the sector plans, and your medium-term expenditure framework. And in order to determine whether you can raise a green bond, you've got to match those processes and the determinations from your strategy and your mandate to invest in certain projects to make sure that you have the right set of projects and those projects are actually in fact green as defined. And then you've got to look at that, how that fits into your operating budget. So now we're in budgeting and we look at, do the planned operating expenditures fit in? Does the capital budgeting fit in? Because in most cases, the bigger spend items are big capital items, and largely we're talking here about infrastructure or assets that are going to be bought. And then does the service delivery and the outcomes and the reporting of those outcomes, are they consistent with the reporting framework that you'd need within the municipality? And does that coalesce and correspond with what you'd need to report on a green bond in terms of the framework you're developing? And then, so the municipal management, the regulations and the standards and the processes of a municipality then match to what is happening with the set of ring-fenced projects that you are funding and ring-fenced activities that you are funding through the implementation process, what you have in blue on this slide. And that management of proceeds and the definition of those processes then are very, very important to be aligned with what's currently going on, what is regulated, the approval processes, the meeting processes, the documentation processes, and so forth. And so the circle goes on. And what you want to create is this virtuous circle where the management and the issuance of green bond matches as closely as possible to what your requirements are as a regulated entity, what the processes are and how are they defined in terms of your strategy and your requirements, and then also within the political cycle. So moving on then to green bonds as a way to raise money for a municipality. Now, as you see on the slide, clearly the opportunities outweigh the challenges in terms of the balance, but there are challenges and there are things that municipalities need to be aware of in order to make sure that they manage the issuance of green bonds correctly. But let's start with the opportunities here. So what does a green bond allow you to do? Primarily, it defines how you're going to spend the money. And because there are a lot of investors who wish to invest in projects and in instruments which are green and are defined as such and can be guaranteed to be defined as such because they're being done in in concert with a certain set of compliance procedures, the amount of investors that you would have access to would be much greater than if you're issuing normal municipal finance, and it extends the amount of investors that theoretically could invest. Not only that, you saw that Wendy earlier on talked about what the role of DFIs is. Now, DFIs have very specific mandate requirements which push them to invest in things which are developmental, which meet certain environmental standards and governance standards. And of course, green bonds, if they are compliant, would do this. So it widens the net to a greater amount of DFI financing. But also what it does is it shows a commitment, and in terms of a public relations and also consistency with national strategy, that you can match the allocation of your funding to activities which are consistent with national strategy, national targets, and so forth. So the last sort of thing that might happen, and I'm going to come back to this in the question and answer session, is in some cases you might have a pricing advantage. Now, 99% of the time that isn't true, but I'll explain how the advantage might work when we come to the question and answer session. But of course, there are challenges. It imposes a greater set of monitoring and evaluation processes. There are administrative costs in doing that, because you have to ring fence the allocation of money, either physically in separate accounts, and you're not allowed to spend that money on other activities if that's the way you're approaching your green bond, which means you've got to hold on to cash maybe that's not spent immediately, which has a little bit of fiscal drag associated with that. In other words, you're investing money in the short term, which is not being used, which has a lower interest rate from that, from the borrowing which you have done. And there are ways to overcome that with much more sophisticated reporting, but again, that comes at an expense. Of course, there are financial risks associated with any project, which are true for green bond, but in some cases, if you're ring fencing the money and you're taking on, let's say, a more risky project, that might be a challenge to manage. The other challenge is having a very robust framework down to detailed technical screening criteria for what is green in a project. And you have to make sure that you are sufficiently familiar and that, with what national legislation is, whether if you've got a national taxonomy, which is now the case in South Africa, and whether that needs to be consistent with both international standards, which you've agreed to be consistent with in your framework that you publish along with your bond, and on top of that, with any legislation or strategy which is defined in the strategy documents of the council itself. So this slide is probably the most important slide, and it shows in a single slide what is contained in the green, in the Municipal Sustainable Bond Handbook. And all of these stages are explained in detail, and the requirements of each stage and the determination of whether that stage is complete or compliant is explained in simple terms for the layperson in the handbook. And again, this has been a difficult process, and again, well done to Christoph van Vuuren and the Carbon Trust team, because it's been done in a way which is very digestible, right through from pre-issuance. So the early stage planning and almost decision process as to whether this is a process that you want to continue with and it makes sense for the council, right through to your post-issuance reporting. So once you've issued the bond and you've actually raised the money and you start applying that money to the project, what reporting mechanisms do you need, and how do you make sure those are consistent with legislation, with your reporting standards internally, with your IT system, and with, if it is a listed bond, for example, with the JSE requirements. So in each of these processes, there's a set number of activities, that is a set number of considerations, and these are explained in the handbook. And I'm going to go through one or two interesting points and things which are, in my opinion, very important, and usually in the issuance of a green bond create the most difficulty or the greatest challenges. And this is based on experience of my firm doing work in places as far-fetched as Fiji, but also in developed markets for the things like the national sovereign bond of the Italian government. And interestingly enough, the issuance of a green bond and the allocation and use of proceeds eligibility is actually an area which is uniformly the most difficult to tackle, as opposed to what most people think is just understanding the process and complying with legislation and requirements for listing, which is in fact, in practicality, a slightly easier process. So let's deal with one of the key elements, which is the project screening and eligibility. Now, this is very, very important, because if you want to issue a green bond, you're issuing an instrument which is debt, which is a common instrument. In other words, the debt agreement is the same for all investors, but it's also a tradable instrument, and it's got characteristics that need to make sure that you can report at a detailed level on this. And a use of proceeds bond imposes the requirements that the funds that you raised are only and exclusively used for those projects and activities which are defined upfront as green and which are identified. So where does this create problems? The first thing is to determine whether you have a framework for assessing the group of projects that you might have in your expenditure plans, and determining which of those would fit in with the criteria. So you've got to have established what your reference criteria are with reference to both your framework document, which is a document which sets out how you're going to issue a green bond and according to what rules and regulations, but also the reference taxonomy and down to the technical or detailed screening criteria that you're going to use. So for example, areas which are obviously green are usually quite easy. So you have areas like funding of a rooftop solar for public sector buildings. Now, generally solar and generation of energy using renewables is quite easy, but you might have also some work which is done around transport. And so you might have let's say a light railway, which is going through the city. Now, the effective carbon emissions on that particular project might be net of what public sector travel using, let's say, for example, in South Africa, taxis might be beneficial, but there'll be other components of that light railway. In other words, are people being displaced when you're laying the rail line? What are the social effects of that? Is the way the construction being done, the use of concrete, is that actually green? And depending on what screening criteria you use and what references you're using, those might or might not be green. So in a general view of where the projects are and the amount of projects that you have might say that you have a set of green projects which will comply, you've got to go back to your reference and make sure that those projects do actually comply and they are consistent. So for example, under the South African taxonomy, the transport requirements are quite tight. They're quite difficult to meet in terms of emissions reductions or maximum emissions. And that means that projects that you might have in your general thought as green might not in fact be green. So what this means is, if you want to issue a bond and make it worthwhile, you've got to issue a certain amount of money or raise a certain amount of money to make the bond process, which is slightly more expensive than just a bilateral loan process, make it worthwhile. And you're going to make sure that the amount of projects that you have over that period of time where it makes sense to raise the money and use the money exclusively for it is actually there. And then you'll go through this process, which is explained in this little puzzle. So you'll look at the feasibility studies, you'll identify the risks and the challenges, you'll shortlist projects, you look at the project's business plan, you look at the ENS, environmental and social benefits of the projects, and so forth and so forth. And you'll align your process of planning, which is normally the case in the municipality, with those compliance procedures and the meeting of the requirements of your green bond framework. And that's where the matching of the MFMA and other related regulation works with your sustainable framework. So the Green Bond Handbook takes you through this process and explains what is needed in each step. But not only that, it's got a lot of other useful information in it, which provides some background as to how a green bond works and where it's worked differently with similar types of institutions. So the city of Cape Town was mentioned earlier. That's one of the case studies in the Green Bond Handbook. The Mexico City is obviously a very good example, but it also talks about the enabling environment. And one thing I do want to say is, as a South African, we love to moan and we love to say things don't work and what's not going well with the country. But in truth, South Africa is one of the few middle-income countries which has a very sophisticated capital market. It has a very active bond market. It's been doing it for years. It has a very forward-thinking exchange. It has very active and technically astute people at the Treasury. You would have seen in the previous presentation. And that combination of factors is in fact quite unique in a middle-income country. Not only that, you've got a history of a large pension fund and institutional insurance investor base investing in the capital markets in South Africa, and both through direct lending, and the renewable energy independent procurement program is a very good example of this, where pension funds have been quite big investors in that. Now, this investor base needs to be mobilized, and the useful information in the handbook explains what the enabling environment is in South Africa. So what does the sustainability segment mean? What are the rules of the sustainability segment in the JSE? And again, as an exchange, when you compare it even to some of the developed market exchanges, the JSE is very forward thinking and imposes very clear definitions and rules and procedures on issuers of debt who are issuing green bonds. Then on top of that, there are some guidelines and additional information in the handbook which talks around things like environmental impact indicators and what are typical sectors for green bonds. What tools can you use for those? And then lastly, within the South African environment and more generally, what is the pertinent set of regulations and why are those important when you're looking at the handbook? So this is where I'll end the presentation and just thank you for that. But please use the handbook. If you have any questions after my presentation, please ask in the Q&A, but make use of it. Send it around to as many people as you can. It is, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of all the people who've been involved in the process, a very useful, a very practical, and quite unique document in the sense that it provides the layperson who has some exposure to the capital markets, some exposure to municipalities, a good idea of what needs to be done without a lot of the very, how can I say, over positive sort of pumping up of the environmental sector. Very practical, step by step. This is what you need to do. These are the requirements. These are the challenges. And this is how you can end up with a successful issuance. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very, very much, and looking forward to any questions.
Thank you, Gregor, for that. You've made it very simple and consumable or absorbable. That is a unique document, really ideal for anybody, including a lay person. And there's a very good practical guide, especially for those who are going into that particular space. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm quite happy to hear these words from Gregor and also from Wendy and of course Janita, because it is really resonating very well with me, in the sense that this document is described as monumental piece of work, fantastic initiative, it's a comprehensive guide, where right through preparation, issuance, and management, is really responding or reflective of the existing national legislative regimes. And this is really very, very encouraging for a document like this that really needs to be embraced by those of us who want to raise capital to respond to this triple planetary crisis that we're dealing with, of the climate change, biodiversity loss, and also the pollution and chemicals and waste. Now, just for your information, on this particular platform, we have more than 9 countries represented. We have Kenya, we have United Kingdom, United States, we have Thailand, we have South Africa, we have Rwanda, Slovakia, you have Japan, and France. So this is very, very representative, and I'm quite happy that, to the all corners of the world, we are able to share this useful information so that we can have ambassadors with those particular countries. Now, I've been watching the chats and also the Q&A. I'm not seeing any question that has been raised on the Q&A, and on the chat, I think we've just been chatting between the coordinators in here. So I think we have come to the point where I would like to open the floor for the Q&A. You're invited to go to the chat or to the Q&A, but at the same time, you can use the raise hand facility so that I can see you on the screen and give you an opportunity to raise an issue based on what the previous speakers have alluded to, so that we can actually enjoy this particular session. The floor is open. You raise your hand, and when you're given a chance, you'll be unmuted. And if you have your video on, then we'd also like to see you, if you don't mind, so that we can engage in this particular discussion. Anybody? Andre? Anybody from Bangkok? I mean, I'm a teacher by profession. They say silence means concurrence. In other words, okay, I can see there's a question at Q&A. This is from Karen Galan. The question is, how unique is this in the context of the continent and globally? Okay, I think, Gregor, may I throw that to you? Would you want to respond?
Yeah, so the answer to this can be short or it can be long. I'll try and give you the short answer. So first of all, on the continent, there are some unique aspects to South Africa, which I explained, which were that South Africa has an active capital markets, it has an active bond market. There are investors which are very sophisticated. Even South African treasuries, bonds issued by the national government are very liquidly traded on the international market. So that in the context of the continent is, I would say, in aggregate, a little bit unusual. As far as the handbook itself and the steps that would be taken by the South African South African municipalities in going through the process of issuing of a green bond, it is largely self-similar to other municipalities or local authorities, however the financing mechanism of the country actually works at sub-sovereign level. But the difference would be threefold. The first difference would be that the equivalent of the management finance acts and the spatial planning frameworks and so forth would have different regulations. So the planning process and the cycle might be a little bit different from country to country. The second thing is that South African municipalities would largely struggle to issue bonds if you had to look across the country, but there are some larger municipalities which can. In other words, they're sufficiently creditworthy. That's less true elsewhere in Africa. So your municipalities might not have sufficient credit. They might be so far down the investment grade a level that issuing of a bond at all might not be appropriate. Now, that's not true for some of the larger cities, especially in North Africa and West and Eastern Africa. So it is a possibility. Thirdly, the difference is the extent to which you're issuing it in local currency or foreign currency. Now, South Africa has an active rand bond market, and in countries where there isn't a local investment, investment community that's investing in local currency bonds, because that market just doesn't exist, you might go out to DFIs to invest in a bond in dollars, which creates slightly more difficulty in hedging, and you've got to be much more careful in terms of creating liabilities in foreign currency at a sub-sovereign level. There might also be rules from national government imposed on local authorities not to do that. So that doesn't mean it can't be done. It just means it becomes a little bit more challenging. As far as globally, is this unique? I'd say the handbook, I haven't seen another handbook talking about the process of issuing green bonds in a municipal environment. That being said, it is equally applicable in terms of the process from the green bond component. And green bonds, the sustainable framework, the setup of the green bond, the reporting and so forth are self-similar across the world because they refer to similar taxonomies and similar guiding principles. So for example, one of the core guiding principles is the ICMA, International Capital Markets Association set of guidelines. There is another international organization which works on a set of slightly different principles, which also is quite common across many countries, called CBI, Climate Bond Initiative. And those disciplines and processes are also multi-country, so are equally applicable. And Cape Town, for example, used that modality to issue their bond. I said I was going to be short. I actually gave you a long answer. Apologies for that.
Thank you, Gregor, for that. I'm glad to see a lot of questions coming in. Asha Dave has a question. We'll give you the floor. You can ask it directly. And also I'll request Christelle to prepare to more or less respond to a question which has been asked by one of the participants on the situation in South Africa. In fact, Msingathi Sipuka, Christelle, this is for you, is saying there is already a financing discrepancy between big and small municipalities in South Africa. The reality is that small municipalities do not have the internal capacity or balance sheets to undertake this. So how does it reinforce these inequalities? So Christelle, you can pick that one. In the meantime, we'll give the chance to Asha David. Asha, first you.
Thank you very much, Henry, and the team. For the overview of the handbook, and really looking forward to seeing how it's going to be used in local governments. I'm keen to understand perhaps what is the expectation or the appetite to use the municipal sustainable bond financing to co-finance with, I want to say, other corporate organizations. So one of the things that we are seeing is quite a few renewable energy projects being introduced by various mining companies. And we know that these mining companies are largely in rural areas. And so, as they embarking on these projects, they're also thinking about how do they ensure energy security for towns around, the communities around their operations specifically, and potentially if municipalities could be supported to access the sustainable bond financing, it could extend or improve the scale of the projects to have a far more significant effect. I just wanted to get thoughts around the thinking and the appetite for this in the South African context.
Thank you, Asha. Asha, we have a Asha who is a colleague of mine, also called Asha David. Are you related, or just a different one?
No, I don't think I'm related.
Okay, thank you, Asha, for that. Christelle, I posed a question. Are you online? Christelle Van Buren? Christelle? Okay, Gregor, would you like to pick this on behalf of Christelle? This question by Msingathi Sipuka about.
Let me answer that question. So, a green bond, as far as the ability of a municipality to raise money to apply to projects, doesn't change the financial condition of the municipality and doesn't improve or make their creditworthiness and their ability to raise money any better or worse. So the discrepancy between big and small municipalities is there, but it's not affected by the process of raising a green bond itself. So if a municipality couldn't raise money, it doesn't have the balance sheet to do so, it doesn't make sense, or the amount of money it needs to raise is not appropriate for raising a bond, which has a certain threshold, then that municipality wouldn't be able to raise money, even if it wanted to build a coal coal power electricity generation station. So the financing discrepancy is something structural. The green bond is not going to solve that, and it's not going to make it any worse. It's just a way of widening the access to investors if you can raise a bond and if you have sufficient projects which are green to apply the use of proceeds to the bond. So the inequalities, unfortunately, in South Africa are there, and that is something that the government and the National Treasury work through every year to try and solve, as well as the political parties running the particular councils are trying to do. But the green bond process doesn't affect that negatively or positively in any way. Henry, please go ahead.
Yeah, have you finished?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Gregor, for that. Christelle, I would like you to compliment what Gregor has said. Try again if you can hear you. I know you had trouble with the voice. Christelle? Okay, we can't hear Christelle. She's online though. Looks like there are challenges in the voice system. And Gregor, there is also another question by Karen Bellan, but I would recommend that you probably type an answer, because Karen is asking, why would you say this particular initiative is important? I think that one you can maybe type a response in the chat. At this point, I would like to task Thomas Salas. More or less, of course, Thomas Salas is going to give us closing remarks, but given his background and the way he's in this particular ecosystem on the financing and all that, Thomas, would you give us some perspective and respond to what's happened? No, not necessarily in the context of South Africa, but you can take in the context of Southern Africa, a region where you're working. Thomas, you spoke yesterday. Share with us your perspective. Unmute yourself.
Yes, good morning to everybody, and thank you very much, Henry. I know that the question always comes, how does Africa respond to the challenges and opportunities arising from the challenge of climate? What net zero means to Africa. And one of the big issues is, as you know, most African countries have engaged and committed under the NDCs, and to a large extent is, where are we going to find the resources to finance those commitments? And the response to this, particularly given today's circumstances, it's a combination of solutions, not one magic. And critical to it, and to things that relate to the need to change, to adapt, to create the enabling conditions to address livelihood needs, comes from what do we do with our cities, municipalities, and states? How do we mobilize the resources in order to expand? Because as you all know, there are large gaps on funding basic infrastructure in many parts of our countries. But above and beyond, how do we find the proper combination of resources and conditions that we can use to harness the potential? So as you know, apart from the public finance, international public finance mechanisms, there is now a deliberate attempt to prepare the financial markets. And to that extent, we had a conversation yesterday, Henry. There is this critical issue of creating the pool, the enabling conditions that will allow to bring and create the proper incentives, the proper capacity, information, technology assess conditions that will make possible for us to address the needs of the African countries. And within it, it is important to also mobilize and leverage the capacities at the local level. So more than ever, you have a situation where collaboration is key, integration is key, and joint action, deliberate joint action, and creative, innovative solutions are also a key part of what needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for that intervention, and it's very, very useful for us. Any other? I can see Janita is responding to Karen. Any other question? Any other hand raised? Technical team from your side. Any hand that I cannot see? Any hand I cannot see? There is also a response that there is also a response from Crystal. It's on the chat, on the Q&A, where Crystal is saying the underlying budgetary controls, financial sustainability challenges, and economic development challenges will remain for those municipalities which are unlikely to have access to bonds, including sustainability bonds. So Crystal is saying prior speakers spoke to capacity needs and shifting considerations regarding disaster relief responses. Nonetheless, the basis of green economy development holds true for any type and size of municipality. And these smaller munis that municipalities should be considering the resilience of the applications of their capital projects and the design of projects and procurement. Crystal, thank you. That's very comprehensive. I think it really answers what Singati was asking, and also the other colleagues on this particular platform. That's very, very useful. Crystal, the technical team is telling me that you're unmuted now. Could you, can you hear your voice?
Shall we try that? Yes, it seems
Great.
so. Thank you, Henry.
Now,
Thank you, everybody.
great. Okay, welcome, Crystal. Could you just compliment what Greco said? Of course, you've already written an answer, but let's hear your voice on that spoken word.
Oh, sure. Well, I suppose I'll keep it short. And again, just thanks to everybody online. And it's lovely to be part of today's session, and really grand to have it see the world. I'm not quite sure how to switch my video on, but so please forgive me. At least you can hear me now. I mean, in addition to, I suppose, having kept it short there, I do really think, and I suppose it ties into whether we're talking about taxonomies or we're talking about green economy development or sustainable finance of any kind, these municipalities where those disparities are in play that are so much more fundamental, there really is from our, sorry, hopefully I'm back again and I haven't been lost, that there needs to be an emphasis on greening their processes in the first place and building resilience and internal capacity. So whether they're able to access green bonds especially is actually sort of a secondary consideration. The realignment with their capital planning and the realignment of their general planning to be better aligned with greening economy considerations and their real public good mandates that really marry one another means that the conversation shifts from capital access to what is within their control to a large extent, which is design of projects and procurement, as I mentioned, notwithstanding, of course, the access to finance challenge and the fact that that is something that is, of course, a very key consideration within the grants and other forms of capital that are being allocated to those distressed municipalities. So I hope that that's a useful contribution to not put aside the complexity and challenges of their funding mechanisms, but to take away that in addition to that, there really needs to be a paradigm shift in any case.
Thank you, Crystal. That's a very fitting bridge for us to come to the end of this session. Just to remind everybody, we have 74 people on this particular platform. There's 20 that you cannot see. unique attendees and unique panelists, 20 panelists who are participating here. And I think that is very encouraging from 9 countries. But in closing, I would really like to take this opportunity to introduce and invite Thomas Sales of UNDP South Africa to make the closing remarks, and especially on behalf of the resident coordinator of South Africa. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you again. Thank you, Henry, and all participants of today's lunch. It is my pleasure to deliver the closing remarks on behalf of the UN Resident Coordinator ad interim and UNDP-RR, Dr. Ayodele Odusola, after our brief but still insightful and forward-looking deliberations. Congratulations again for this timely and needed technical handbook on the topic of issuing municipal sustainable bonds in South Africa. It is, and it will remain for many years to come, an enabling tool and tangible contribution towards the creation of the fundamental aspects of knowledge related to sustainable finance and transition finance in general, and in particular in the area of issuing in particular green bonds issued for municipalities, which, as you know, it's also called as mini green bonds. We appreciate the support from project partners from various UN agencies, initiatives, and institutions that have contributed to make this action-oriented knowledge product a reality. Let me single out and thank the following key project team partners: the South Africa Department of Forestry and Fisheries, the UNDP UNEP Poverty Environment Action for Sustainable Goals Project, the Green Economy Transformation Project by GIZ, the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, of course, the South African government, municipalities, and local organization representatives, such as Carbon Trust, and colleagues from UNEP, Nairobi, the South Africa UN Resident Coordinated Office, and several of my colleagues. Addressing the urgent socioeconomic transformation and resilient development challenge of South Africa will require a sizable investment with significant positive environmental and social sustainable development impacts. Sustainable bonds, as you have heard, are one of the innovative financial mechanisms that could be applied as an instrument to attract investors and ensure that capital is channeled to deliver South Africa's sustainable development needs, as well as support its green economic recovery post-COVID. South Africa is one of the few African countries that pioneered in the municipalities bond market through the issues by the Johannesburg and Cape Town jurisdictions. It is therefore well positioned to seize and benefit from green bonds and take advantage of these innovative finance tools that brings resources from both public and private sector. For municipalities tasked with mobilizing economic resources towards the improvement of livelihood of all citizens, these bonds issued by cities and municipalities could be developed as a powerful financing tool, well suited to diversify sources of finance and raise domestic capital for green infrastructure and sustainable productive activities and projects. The technical handbook on issuing municipal sustainable bonds in South Africa sets out the detailed, accessible, and practical steps involved in the process of issuing bonds and discusses the associated tasks and activities. It also seeks to explore key elements and instruments that provide balanced information so municipalities and other stakeholders can determine whether a sustainable bond is a suitable tool for their organization. In terms of recommendations for using this handbook, The South African municipalities considering the issue of sustainable bonds, the Handbook provides detailed guidance and a step-by-step walk through the process and practical recommendations. The Handbook also provides practical guidance and recommendations, particularly in the context of sound sustainable management, governance and management of pipeline development, project selection, impact assessment, and reporting. The tool also provides the introduction of key concepts and the ecosystem of sustainable bonds, and which can assist those interested in designing, developing, and deploying sustainable finance instruments. In closing, municipal sustainable bonds, it's a timely and much needed sustainable finance instrument with threefold clear benefits, including growing and diversifying the investor base, including domestic investors, informing and involving local communities and their grassroots local organizations, and 3, increasing collaboration and concerted action between environmental and financial sector stakeholders. UNDP is proud to have joined UNEP, the Office of the Resident Coordinator in South Africa, to support this undertake and work together with all project partners here in South Africa. We, alongside other sister UN organizations, are committed to further advance innovative interventions to finance the SDGs, leading to inclusive, sustainable, and resilient outcomes. This work stream directly contributes already to existing initiatives to support South Africa in the areas of sustainable finance, SDG investments, which have been implemented by our country office and the Africa Sustainable Financial Hub in Pretoria. We also see with great interest the opportunity to explore municipal green bonds as an important part of the financial toolkit to support the just energy transaction in South Africa. We also believe this technical handbook and the South African experience can be of utmost interest of other African countries, especially in fast-growing urban areas. And as such, we strongly encourage opportunities for development and sharing of experience. We call upon the wide use of this handbook, and we'd like to see the end-to-end process outlining the handbook to be adopted and implemented in practice. In this regard, we believe that private sector engagement and its mainstreaming within the financial sector is critical to move to the next level and make municipal sustainable bonds a widespread reality. We therefore underscore the need to invite and encourage the involvement of local financial service providers, advisors, institutional investors, the leadership of government and capital markets authorities. The contribution of DFIs is also very important. One concrete example of our keen commitment to move forward is that we are currently holding discussions between UNDP and UNCDF to create a new African-wide municipal bond capacity development and readiness project. I would like to request that you, within your area of competence and capabilities, do use this handbook and the community of practice that has emerged from preparing it towards concrete field and impact action, particularly starting with the 2 municipalities that have been involved. We also stand ready to work with partners and stakeholders to promote and scale up sustainable financial solutions in South Africa and other African countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas Sales, for those fitting closing remarks on this. We are slightly just 1 minute above the allocated time, but you've done very well. Just to resonate, thank you for highlighting the fact that this handbook is a very much needed financial instrument, okay, and setting out, or rather citing, the involvement of the domestic investors, the community participation, the community practice, collaboration between institutions, the issue on sustainable finance, which is really very key, and the sharing of experiences, the private sector engagement, and the capital markets authorities and DFIs. I think this really brings us to a very, very good closing point. Now, I would like to invite everybody to look at the chat. The chat has provided a link to access the handbook. So you can copy that and you can access that handbook so that you can read it at your own time or make any references. And the way Thomas Sales has said, let us use this to spread the word, to sensitize people. Yesterday, we were discussing with Thomas that there is some kind of lethargy in Africa, especially the private sector, to go into the space of the green bonds. But to say we really need to think about the pull factor. What are the incentives that will encourage the private sector to come and become key participants in this particular process? Because the financial world is very, very strong from the private sector side. And we saw that obviously during the COVID period, where the financial muscle existed. And I think it is important in the collaboration of governments and the policy changes, the policy regime, we should be able to use this as a very good springboard or to anchor the green bond process here. Petras Wepada, we saw your hand after we had started the closing remarks. So Petras, I might not give you a chance now, but you're most welcome to pose your question or your comment on the chat so that we can make a response to it with time. So ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, thank you very much for your patience. For those people who are in the US, I think you woke up very early. For those people in Japan, on the other side, I know you're about to go to bed. For those of us in Africa, good morning, if it is not noon yet, and good afternoon if it is afternoon for those people. And thank you for being patient and attending this session. Bye-bye for now, and see you next.